In the previous lecture, we brought our zombies into our terrain. So we now have all of our assets in the actual game level. All that's really left to do, as far as this particular functionality of the mechanics, is to get the zombies to chase the player and be able to actually shoot the zombies, and the zombies do damage to the player. Okay, so when I say that's all we have to do, that is quite a bit, isn't it? The first thing we're going to do, though, is to get the zombies to move towards our player and chase our player, which is one of the main mechanics. We're going to use something called a navigation mesh. Now, this is like the fantastic gift to AI because it saves you coding so much and does a lot of the automatic stuff for you. What a navigation mesh is basically a sort of mesh that's put over the top of a terrain or inside a building or wherever that specifies where characters and things can walk or run or whatever. And therefore it can reduce an awful lot of logic that you would have to write by hand. And you can also use the navigation mesh to automatically get your characters to move around and plan the paths they're going to take to get from one side to the other. So what we're going to do first is create a navigation mesh. And to do that, we have to click on our terrain. Then you want to go up to Window, down to AI, and click on Navigation. Now, once you've done that, you will get this tab come up, Navigation. I've already got mine docked. Yours might just pop up as a window. I usually dock it behind the inspector, but of course you can put it wherever you like. Now, you will see that my map has blue areas on it. Yours will not yet. The reason I have blue areas is because I have already created the nav mesh. So what you need to do right now is to click on Bake, which is at the top here, and don't change any other settings. Click on this Bake button here. Once you've done that, it's going to take a fair bit of time to bake. And actually, if I do that, it will show you down the bottom. You're going to get this little bar here saying how far through it is, and it's going to take a while. So sit back or go and get a cup of coffee. And when we come back, I will discuss what the nav mesh has created on your terrain. Okay, once that's done, if you select your terrain with the navigation tab open, you should see blue areas on it. If you don't, you might have to tick this Show Nav Mesh box here, which will then bring up your nav mesh. Now, you won't see all of it. As you can see, as I zoom in, it starts to pop into view. The parts that are blue, if we just have a little bit of a look around here, are parts where our zombies will be able to walk. So you can see that these trees, for example, aren't part of the nav mesh, so the zombies will avoid them. And that's why we don't have to worry about collisions for our zombies, because they're only going to stay where this is blue. Now you can see that it's not blue up here on this slope. Why is that? Well, if you go over to the settings for your navigation and bake, you'll see that there's this max slope and it's set to 45. So anything that's greater than a 45-degree incline like this here will be left out of your nav mesh. If you want to lower that even further, then of course you could turn that down and rebake, which I won't do right now because you saw how long that really took before. And you don't, on this particular map, you probably don't want to lower that because there will be areas where the zombies can't get to or follow the entire path around. And really you would have to sit down and follow this whole thing around to make sure that the zombies can get from one spot to the other. Now you'll see that there's a few spots down here that look a bit like they've missed out, but if you zoom in you'll see that that's just a sort of a rendering issue. Okay, so I want to point out how things get excluded from being on the nav mesh, such as the trees. Well, if we just go to our altar, let's double click on the altar here, have a look at this. So the rocks you can see have been left out, but these pillars haven't. So the nav mesh is not going around them, which would mean the zombies would actually walk through the middle of these pillars. The reason being, if we hit the W key and then select one of these pillars, over in our inspector, and we just have to click off navigation for a moment. Let me bring that across. There's this little static drop down tab. If you want to include those pillars, or if you want to include anything as part of the sort of collision objects in a nav mesh environment, then they need to be navigation static. So all of those pillars you would need to set as navigation static. Now I might actually be able to just shift select everything that's around that altar and do that anyway. So if we go there and go navigation static, did that turn it on or off? Okay, let's now have a look. And yep, okay, and my pillars are now navigation static. So just checking. Next time I bake, they will in fact be included. So let's actually do that now. So we can see what it's like now. Let me click bake again. And while that's baking, you can just take a little break. Okay, so you can see clearly that we now are not able to walk right close to those pillars, so they've been left out of the navigation mesh. What is determining this particular distance is the agent's radius. Now, what is an agent? A nav mesh agent is the artificially intelligent controlled character that you're going to have walking around on the nav mesh, which will be your zombies. So they will become what's called a nav mesh agent. So for example, if you don't want the zombies to be able to walk through or underneath this set of pillars, then over in the navigation you would change the radius here and make the zombies, well, essentially a bit fatter, I guess. Now the height that you get with your agents is pretty much the normal height for an average character, like we've talked about before when we've looked at the capsule colliders, for example. So you've got a radius of 0.5 and a height of 2 meters, which is, I guess, a quite tall character, but this is suitable for the zombies that we've got. But of course, you've got the option where you can adjust those. Make sure you bake again, and then you'll be able to see the different areas where your characters can get to or not. Now, if you have other parts of your nav mesh that you want your zombies to be able to jump over, so let's see if we can find a spot down here under these trees. Okay, so probably a bit dense here, but see there's this like cliff face here, and you can walk up there and you can walk down here, but you can't actually get from here directly up there. You can create what's called off mesh links, and you can see those over here in the navigation. So you can actually set the height for how much somebody can drop down, so whether the zombies can actually drop down here, and the height for how far they can jump. And the jump distance is not this here, but it's a gap in the mesh. So if we zoom out again and have a bit of a look for maybe a gap, a gap would be something that is flat where maybe the mesh didn't actually join up, which, because we used a train, it's not necessarily an issue. But let's say that you could walk on here and you wanted to jump from there straight across there, then that would be sort of the jump distance, which is, I guess, more of a horizontal jump than a vertical jump. Once you're happy with your nav mesh, and you can change it at any time and add extra things, you just have to remember to keep rebaking it. We're going to go over to our zombie girl that we added in earlier. So there she is there. Now, one thing I will point out, see how we have her sitting on the ground. If we can just like go down here, you can still see the ground. See, there's this gap between the actual ground and this one here. If you want, and you probably do, want your characters to be on the actual ground, not floating above. So anywhere it's blue, your nav mesh agents are going to sit. That's their ground. Now, in order to make the nav mesh ground the same as the actual ground of the terrain, it's a little bit of extra processing on behalf of the nav mesh. So to do that though, which you probably do, go over to the Bake tab again and just click on Advanced, and then there's this height mesh here, and if you click on that you can then bake it, and that will fix the problem of your characters floating above the ground. But for now I'm not going to do that because it takes a bit of time, but you can do that at the end of this video. But make sure that you do have the terrain object selected before you do the bake. We're just going to turn our zombie into a nav mesh agent. So with it selected, go into the inspector and we're going to add a component. Just type in NA or something for nav mesh agent and it will come up immediately. So just select nav mesh agent and add that component to the zombie. You'll see immediately over in your scene view that you get this collider around the zombie. This is the nav mesh agent's collider. And you'll see that this is the bottom here. And if we can go back to our terrain to get that blue bit back up again in navigation, might be able to shift select both of those. Yep, okay, so you can see that her feet are underneath there, but once this starts playing, she'll actually pop up and sit on top of there. So let's just have a look if I press play right now. Okay, so see what happened? You can see that her feet are now sitting nicely on there. But without that, if I unselect it and get away from the navigation, she will now appear to be slightly floating above the ground. And that's why you want that height mesh in there. But coming back to our zombie girl, the size, as I said before, is pretty regular for a nav mesh agent who's humanoid in size, and we've been working on regular sizes, and so therefore we've only had to add that nav mesh agent to her to make her into something that will now follow that nav mesh around. Okay, so you might like to go off and bake the heights into your terrain. When we come back in the next lecture, we'll start getting our nav mesh agent, our zombie here, to follow our player around.